The dog hadn't eaten in 6 days. He'd bitten 3 orderlies, destroyed 2 IV stations, and put a veterinary technician in the ER with a fractured wrist. The command decision was already signed. Ghost, decorated military working dog, 11 confirmed combat deployments, Medal of Valor recipient, was scheduled for termination in 48 hours. And the woman they sent to stop it? A nurse. 29 years old. No rank visible. No credentials anyone bothered to check. She walked through the doors of Greystone Valley Medical Center carrying a duffel bag and wearing the kind of expression that didn't ask for permission. The doctors laughed. Ghost stopped growling the second she stepped into the corridor. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss what comes next, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning it started, rain was coming down sideways across the parking lot of Greystone Valley Medical Center, and nobody was in a good mood. The facility sat at the edge of a mid-sized Pennsylvania city called Delford, the kind of place where the steel industry had left decades ago, but the buildings hadn't gotten the memo. Greystone Valley was the largest hospital in the county, recently renovated with federal grant money and new administrative leadership that cared very much about metrics, liability, and reputation, roughly in that order. It had a trauma wing, a cardiovascular unit, a research floor, and, uncomfortably, following a Department of Defense pilot program 2 years prior, a specialized veterinary trauma annex attached to the East Building. That annex was where the problem lived. The problem had a name. Ghost. 94 pounds of Belgian Malinois with a titanium tooth cap on his left upper canine, a 3-inch scar running along his left shoulder blade from an IED fragment, and a service record that most active duty soldiers would envy. He'd been assigned to Special Forces Detachment 7 Alpha as a working dog for 6 years. His handler, the only person who had ever successfully managed him outside a controlled training environment, was a staff sergeant and combat medic named Daniel Voss. Voss had died 11 days ago. A vehicle ambush in a location the official report described only as a forward operating area. He was 31. He had a sister in Columbus and a dog he'd raised from a 10-week-old pup. Ghost had been flown stateside 4 days after the death, accompanied by a behavioral flag in his file and a note from the forward veterinary officer that read, "Animal is exhibiting acute stress responses consistent with handler loss. Recommend immediate placement with familiar contact or trained trauma specialist." Nobody at Greystone Valley had read that note carefully. Or if they had, they'd filed it somewhere it didn't inconvenience anyone. The dog had been in the annex for 6 days. He hadn't eaten. He'd refused every sedation attempt after the third one sent him into a cardiac arrhythmia that nearly killed him on the table. He'd injured 4 people, not unprovoked, but the nuance didn't matter to hospital administration. The enclosure smelled like fear and grief and fluorescent lighting, and Ghost spent most of his time pressed into the far corner with his chin on the floor, staring at the door, waiting for someone who wasn't coming back. The termination order had been approved at 9:14 Tuesday morning by Hospital Director Gavin Marsh, countersigned by the Chief of Veterinary Services, and routed to the Department of Defense liaison for acknowledgement. 48 hours. That was the window. After that, it was paperwork. The DoD liaison, a mid-level administrator named Collins, who mostly handled procurement disputes and had no idea what to do with a traumatized combat dog, had made one phone call before signing off. That phone call had gone somewhere Collins didn't fully understand, and at 7:52 Wednesday morning, a woman walked through the front entrance of Greystone Valley Medical Center in plain blue scrubs, a black waterproof jacket, and boots that had seen more actual field conditions than anyone on staff would have guessed. Her name, according to the temporary staff badge she'd been issued, was Nora Vance. She checked in at the administrative desk without being asked twice, signed the contractor paperwork the clerk slid across without reading it carefully, and asked for directions to the veterinary annex. The clerk, a young guy named Tyler who was on his second coffee and already exhausted, glanced up. "You're the consult they called in?" "That's right." "For the dog?" "Yes." Tyler looked at her badge, then at her face, then back at her badge. "They said a specialist was coming. I figured—" He stopped himself. "Figured what?" I don't know, someone from, like, a facility. Nora picked up the visitor lanyard he'd printed for her. I am from a facility. She walked toward the east corridor before he could respond. The annex was past the radiology wing, through two sets of keycard doors that a nurse named Patricia had to open for her because her temporary credentials hadn't been fully activated yet. Patricia was 53, broad-shouldered, and possessed of the particular exhaustion that comes from working a medical facility for 22 years and watching it change management 4 times. "You're here for the Malinois," Patricia said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "He bit Marcus yesterday. Medic, 7 stitches." "I heard." "And you're still going?" Nora glanced sideways at her. "That's what I'm here for." Patricia pressed the second key card against the panel and held the door. She looked at Nora the way people look at someone they've already decided they can't help. "Good luck, then." The annex smelled like disinfectant and wet dog and something underneath both of those things. Something older and harder to name. Nora stopped just inside the door and stood still for a moment, not moving toward the enclosures, just breathing the air and letting her eyes adjust to the different light. There were 3 enclosures on the left wall. 2 were empty. The third, at the far end, had a reinforced door with a red behavioral flag zip-tied to the latch. Ghost was in the corner, exactly where every report said he'd be. He heard her come in. His head came up. His body didn't move, but something in his posture shifted. A microscopic recalibration, the kind that took years of working with animals to even notice. He wasn't lunging, he wasn't growling, he was watching. Nora didn't approach the enclosure. She pulled a folding chair from beside the supply cabinet, set it down about 8 feet from the door, and sat down. That was all. She sat there. Dr. Elliot Farrow found her 40 minutes later. Farrow was the senior physician overseeing the annex, a role he'd inherited when the DoD pilot program launched and nobody else wanted it. He was 56, academically credentialed to a degree that impressed most people, and possessed of the clinical certainty that comes from never having been seriously wrong in a context where anyone held him accountable. He had salt and pepper hair, a lanyard with 3 different badge credentials, and a tone of voice that had spent decades learning how to be dismissive while technically remaining polite. He stopped in the doorway of the annex and looked at Nora sitting in the folding chair. "You're the consult." "Yes." "Nora Vance?" "That's right." He walked in, glancing at the enclosure, then back at her. "You're a nurse." "I am." The referral said trauma specialist. "Both things can be true." Farrow's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it shifted. The particular recalibration of a man deciding how much of his condescension to display in the first 30 seconds. He settled on a moderate amount. "I wasn't aware that nursing credentials qualified someone for behavioral trauma assessment in a military working animal." "They don't, on their own," Nora said. She hadn't stood up. She was watching Ghost while she talked, not Farrow. "That's why I have additional training." "From where?" "Army Medical Operations." Farrow made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I see." He looked at the enclosure again. "He hasn't responded to any of our approaches. 3 different certified animal behaviorists since Monday. The sedation protocol nearly killed him." "I know. I read the chart." "And you think sitting in a chair is going to accomplish something different?" Nora finally looked at him. Her eyes were a specific shade of gray. Not warm, not cold, just very still. "I think rushing an animal in acute grief is how people get hurt. Which is how you got to 7 stitches on a medic yesterday." Farrow's jaw tightened. "That dog is a liability. The termination order is still 46 hours out," Nora said. "I have 46 hours. The hospital director has made the decision. Then I have 46 hours to change it." There was a pause. In the enclosure, Ghost had shifted slightly. Not toward Nora, but his body was no longer fully turned away. Farrow straightened his lapels in the way of a man preparing a decisive exit. "I'll want hourly progress reports. Anything happens in there, I need to know. And Nurse Vance," he let the title land with its full intended weight, "if he injures anyone else, you're personally liable under the contractor agreement." "Understood." He left. Nora turned back to the enclosure. Ghost was looking at her now, full eye contact, which, with a traumatized dog, was either a threat display or something else entirely. "I know," she said quietly. "Me too." Cool. The first real confrontation happened at noon. Nora had been in the annex for 4 hours. She hadn't tried to open the enclosure. She'd moved her chair incrementally closer over the course of the morning, 3 inches, then another 3, the kind of movement designed to register below the threshold of alarm. Ghost had watched every adjustment with his chin still resting on the floor, those yellow-brown eyes tracking her in the slow, exhausted way of an animal that had stopped expecting good outcomes but hadn't entirely stopped paying attention. She'd eaten half a granola bar and drunk a thermos of coffee. She'd spoken out loud at intervals, not to Ghost specifically, not commands, just words, neutral words, names of states, the periodic table. She was providing sound without pressure, presence without demand, which was a technique precisely no one at Greystone Valley had thought to try. And the reason was simple. It wasn't in any standard protocol. You had to have learned it somewhere specific. The noon confrontation came in the form of 2 people, Pharaoh and the hospital's chief veterinary officer, a compact man named Dr. Brendan Solis, who had the rapid-fire certainty of someone who'd spent his career mostly with horses and had strong opinions about everything. He was flanked by a woman from administration named Karen Price, who carried a tablet and looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. 4 hours, Solis said, looking at Nora and the unchanged situation. "You've moved a chair 3 feet. 4.5. Solis looked at Pharaoh. Pharaoh's expression conveyed "I told you so" without needing words. "This isn't working," Price said, tapping something on her tablet. "We have a board meeting tomorrow. The liability exposure from keeping this animal is less than the liability from the complaints filed after an unauthorized termination of a decorated service animal," Nora said. Price paused. "Excuse me? Ghost holds a Medal of Valor and 2 service commendations. His termination will require DOD sign-off, media relations preparation, and documentation that every reasonable treatment option was exhausted. 4 hours with a folding chair is not exhaustive documentation." The room went quiet for a moment. Solis crossed his arms. "Where exactly did you get your certification in military working animal trauma?" "It's on file with the contractor agreement. I'd like to see it directly." Nora reached into the side pocket of her jacket and produced a folded document. She handed it to him without standing. Solis unfolded it, read it. His expression moved through several stages. He refolded it and handed it to Pharaoh, who read it with less reaction but a tighter jaw. Then he handed it back. "That program," Solis said, "was classified." "Parts of it still are," Nora said. Another pause. In the enclosure, Ghost had lifted his head. He was watching the group at the door with a different quality of attention. Alert, not aggressive, reading the room the way working dogs do. Price looked at Pharaoh. "What does that mean for our liability framework?" "I'll find out," Pharaoh said tightly. He looked at Nora. "You have until end of day tomorrow. If there's no measurable progress—" "There's already measurable progress," Nora said. She nodded toward the enclosure. They looked. Ghost was standing, not lunging, not barking, standing, weight forward, nose working the air in Nora's direction. It was the first time he'd stood voluntarily since he arrived. Solis made a sound he probably didn't intend to make out loud. Pharaoh said nothing. Price wrote something on her tablet. "End of day tomorrow," Pharaoh repeated, and left. What nobody except Nora noticed was the specific direction Ghost's nose had moved when she produced that document from her jacket pocket. The jacket that still, under certain conditions, carried the residual scent of a specific military-grade equipment oil used in one branch of Army medical operations for field sterilization kits. It was not a smell that existed anywhere else in the world in quite that combination. Ghost had smelled it the moment she walked through the annex door. That was why he hadn't growled. The afternoon shift brought a different quality of hostility. The morning staff had been surprised. The afternoon staff had been briefed. Word traveled in hospitals the way it always does, faster than administration intends, louder than fax support. And by 2 p.m., the picture that had assembled itself in the staff break room was, some nurse pulled in from outside, No real credentials, sitting with a dying dog and wasting time while costing the hospital money. The version that included the classified document had not yet circulated. Farrow had seen to that. A scrub tech named Devin, 24 years old and possessed of the particular confidence of someone who'd never been seriously wrong yet, stopped in the annex doorway at 2:15 with a supply cart and a smirk. "So you're the dog whisperer," he said. Nora didn't look up from the notebook she'd been making observations in. "I'm the consult." "Right." He started unloading supplies into the cabinet, loudly, because the situation apparently called for it. "My buddy Marcus is at home with his arm in a sling because of that dog." "I know. I'm sorry that happened to him." "Are you?" Devin glanced at the enclosure. Ghost had gone back to his corner when the new person arrived. "Doesn't seem like you're doing much." "It looks that way from the door." Devin pushed the empty cart toward the exit, paused. "Everyone's saying you're not even a real trauma specialist, that they just sent you because nobody else would come." Nora wrote something in her notebook. "What do you think?" "I think it's weird that you've been sitting in a chair all day and calling it work." "That's fair," Nora said. "Come back tomorrow morning." He left. She heard him say something to someone in the hallway. She caught the word waste, and then it was quiet again. She put down the notebook and looked at Ghost. He was watching the doorway where Devin had been, the way dogs watch spaces where people have recently been and might return. Then his eyes moved to Nora. "I know," she said. "He's not important." She reached into the duffel bag she'd brought in that morning and for the first time took out a small item. A worn canvas toy, knotted rope, military-issue bite work training equipment. She placed it on the floor in front of her chair. She didn't offer it. She didn't push it toward the enclosure. She just set it down. Ghost's entire body changed, not dramatically, not the Hollywood version of a dog suddenly bounding forward with its tail wagging, something quieter and more devastating than that. His head came up, his ears shifted forward, and his nostrils flared in 3 quick, tight bursts. Then he lay back down. But his chin wasn't on his paws anymore. He was upright. He was watching the toy. Nora sat very still and didn't look at him directly. Outside the annex, she heard the rain pick up again. At 4:30 p.m., Dr. Farrow returned with reinforcements. The reinforcements were a woman named Dr. Sylvia Holt, who held a dual appointment in veterinary medicine and behavioral psychology and had been flown in, Farrow made a point of mentioning this twice, from a research institution in Maryland specifically to assess the situation. Holt was in her mid-40s, precise in her movements, with the manner of someone accustomed to her expertise being the final word in a room. She stood in the annex doorway, observed Nora with the toy on the floor and the unchanged position of the chair, and said, "This is contact desensitization without environmental reinforcement. It's a basic approach." "It's the right approach for this specific animal," Nora said. "Basic and correct aren't the same thing as basic and wrong." Holt looked at her with the particular quality of an expert encountering someone who isn't deferring correctly. "I've worked with 11 military working dogs in post-handler trauma states. The literature supports phased reintroduction with a familiar contact or trained trauma specialist," Nora said. "I know the literature. I contributed to part of it." The silence that followed had a specific texture. Farrow stepped in. "Dr. Holt's assessment will be presented to the board tomorrow morning alongside. Dr. Holt's assessment can note that the dog is exhibiting early positive contact response to a familiar scent marker," Nora said, "which wasn't present 3 hours ago. That's measurable progress. If the board wants documentation, that's the documentation." Holt looked at the enclosure. Ghost was still upright, still watching the toy. She was good at her job, good enough that she noticed what that posture meant. "What scent marker?" she asked. "Field Medical Operations Kit. Army issue. He was trained around it for 6 years. And you happen to have it." "I came prepared." Holt and Farrow exchanged a look. It was the look of two people recalibrating something they hadn't expected to need to recalibrate. "I'd like to see your full credentials file," Holt said. "Talk to the contractor administration," Nora said. "I'm not interrupting what I'm doing to have that conversation right now." Another pause. In the enclosure, Ghost had moved, just slightly, just a matter of inches, toward the front of his enclosure. Nobody said anything about that. Nora stayed in the annex until 11 p.m. She didn't open the enclosure that day. She didn't try to. The night shift orderly, a quiet older man named Reuben, who'd been at Greystone Valley for 18 years, checked in twice and brought her a cup of vending machine coffee without being asked. He didn't ask questions. He had the particular wisdom of someone who'd seen enough of both animals and institutions to know when something real was happening, even if he couldn't name it. "He ate," Reuben said at the second check-in, nodding toward the enclosure. Nora looked up. Ghost's food dish, pushed through the slot earlier in the evening, was not empty, but it was less full. 3 or 4 bites, Reuben said. "I wasn't watching the whole time, but it was more than nothing." Nora wrote it down. 6 days, Reuben said quietly. "First time." "Yes." Reuben looked at Ghost, then at Nora. He had the kind of face that had given up performing emotions for other people and just settled into whatever was true. "You come from the military." It wasn't really a question. "I did," Nora said. "Thought so." He picked up the empty coffee cup she'd set aside. "I got a son who served. He didn't come back right either." He paused. "Took time. Same as this." Nora looked at him. "Is he okay now?" "Getting there." Reuben moved toward the door. "Some things don't unhappen. You just find a way to carry them different." He left. Nora sat with that for a while. At 10:50 p.m., she gathered her things. She paused at the enclosure door. Ghost was watching her from his corner, not the corner at the very back, she noticed. He'd moved, just a foot or two, but closer to the door than he'd been at any point in 6 days. "Same time tomorrow," she said. She wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. She walked to the parking lot, got in her car, and sat in the dark for 2 minutes before starting the engine. The rain had stopped, the hospital lights reflected in the wet asphalt in long yellow streaks. She pulled out her phone. One missed call from a number she recognized. No area code displayed, which meant what it always meant. She called it back. It rang twice. "It's working," she said when the line connected. "He ate tonight." The voice on the other end said 3 words. "How much time?" "Less than 40 hours now," Nora said. "And Pharaoh's going to push the board tomorrow. He found something in the contractor file." A pause. "What did he find?" "I don't know yet," Nora said. "But I'm going to need the full record released. The classification is going to become a problem." Another pause. Longer this time. "That's not a simple request." "I know." Nora looked at the hospital entrance through her windshield. "But if they terminate him on paperwork grounds while I'm mid-treatment, it won't matter what I know or what I've done. The dog dies, and the record stays buried." The voice was quiet for a moment. "I'll make some calls," it said. The line went dead. Nora started the engine. She drove to a motel 6 minutes from the hospital, checked in under her name, and was asleep by midnight. 40 hours. She was back at 6 a.m. The morning shift nurse, a heavy-set woman named Deborah, who ran the annex transitions with the efficiency of someone who resented inefficiency, handed her a message when she badged through the east corridor. "Dr. Pharaoh wants to see you before you go in," Deborah said. "I'll see him after." Deborah looked at her. "He said before." "I heard you." Nora kept walking. Pharaoh's office was on the 2nd floor. Nora went to the annex. Ghost was at the enclosure door when she came in, not pressed against it, standing 3 feet back, watching the entrance, waiting. He'd finished the rest of the food from last night. The dish was clean. Nora set down her duffel bag. She didn't make a production of it, didn't react visibly, because an animal in this state didn't need human emotion. It needed steadiness, and steadiness meant not making every small thing into a scene. She pulled the chair to its previous closest position. She sat down. Ghost took 2 steps forward, not toward the door, toward her, through the wire of the enclosure. She sat still. He took another step. His nose was working. His body language was not submissive, not dominant. It was reaching, the specific canine body language of an animal trying to close a gap that shouldn't exist. "I know," Nora said softly. "I know him too." She reached into the duffel and pulled out one more item she hadn't shown him yet. A photograph, not the original. A print, laminated. the kind you make when something matters enough to protect. A man in army combat uniform crouching beside a much younger ghost, both of them squinting against some desert sun, somewhere that couldn't be identified by anything visible in the frame. Daniel Voss. She held it where Ghost could see it, and she didn't look away from him. The sound Ghost made was not a bark. It was not a whine. It was something between those two things, something that came from low in his chest, ancient and private, and not intended for anyone present. He pressed his forehead against the wire of the enclosure door. Nora pressed her palm flat against the same spot on the outside. They stayed like that for a long time. Behind her in the doorway, she didn't know that two orderlies had stopped and were standing very still, watching, and that one of them had taken out his phone, not to film it, just because he needed something to do with his hands, because what he was seeing was the kind of thing that makes you suddenly aware your hands exist. What Nora also didn't know, not yet, was that upstairs in Pharaoh's office, a different kind of movement had started. Because the call she'd made from the parking lot the night before had reached someone who made a call of their own, and that second call had moved through a chain of people in the way that certain calls move, but not fast, but with a particular gravity. And by 7:15 a.m., a requisition for the declassification of one specific personnel file had been submitted through a channel that Pharaoh didn't know existed. And by 7:45 a.m., the duty officer at Greystone Valley's security desk had received a request to clear vehicle access for a non-civilian convoy expected to arrive at some point in the next 12 hours. The duty officer had written expected military visitors on the log and then stared at it for a moment because in 20 years at this desk, that had never been a thing that happened. He picked up the phone to call Pharaoh's office. Down in the annex, Ghost was still pressing his forehead against the wire, and Nora's hand hadn't moved, and neither of them was thinking about what was coming. They were thinking about what had already been lost, and somewhere between those two things, loss and what comes after, something that had been shut down for 6 days was slowly and painfully, and without any cinematic grace, beginning to open back up. The two orderlies in the doorway didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then the younger one, a guy named Terrence, 22, 8 months into the job, quietly pocketed his phone and walked away without explaining himself to the older one. He went to the break room, poured a cup of coffee he didn't drink, and stood at the window looking at the parking lot. He wasn't sure what he'd just witnessed, but it had done something to him that he didn't have words for yet and wasn't going to try to find. The older orderly, a man named Pete, who'd worked hospital systems for 30 years and thought he'd seen most categories of things, stood in the doorway a moment longer. He watched Nora's hand against the wire and Ghost's forehead on the other side of it, and he had the specific thought, unbidden, unwelcome, the kind that arrives without asking, that grief was the same shape in every living thing. Then he turned and went back to his cart because he had 3 more rooms to cover, and the work didn't pause for realizations. Nora stayed until Ghost stepped back from the wire on his own terms. He didn't go to the back corner. He lay down 6 feet from the enclosure door, curled his body in a partial C, and closed his eyes. Not the rigid, watchful stillness of an animal bracing for threat. Actual sleep, or something close to it. The kind of unconsciousness that requires the body to decide, at some basic level, that it's safe enough to let go for a few minutes. Nora sat with her elbows on her knees and watched him breathe. She knew better than to call it a breakthrough. She'd seen animals appear to stabilize and then crash within hours. She'd seen the same sequence in people too. Soldiers who seemed to turn a corner in the morning and were unreachable by evening. Progress in grief wasn't linear. It didn't follow a chart. It moved like water finding its way through rock. Not fast, not straight, but with a persistence that eventually changed the shape of things. Still, he was sleeping. After 20 minutes, she stood quietly and went to find Pharaoh. His office was arranged the way offices are when the person inside them wants you to understand certain things about their status before they speak. Framed credentials on the wall, a desk positioned so visitors sat lower than the person behind it. Medical texts organized by publisher on the shelf behind him. A detail that communicated I have read things you haven't rather than any specific reading. Pharaoh was standing when she came in, which meant he'd been waiting and wanted to demonstrate that he hadn't been waiting long. You ignored the message, he said. I had something more important to finish first. In this hospital, when a senior physician sends a message, I'm not a hospital employee, Nora said. I'm a contractor. The contractor agreement gives me operational autonomy within my assigned scope. Farrow looked at her for a moment. Then he moved to his desk and sat down, which changed the geometry of the room in a way she suspected he was aware of. He folded his hands. He'd done this many times. The controlled patience of a man preparing to deliver information he expected to be decisive. I've submitted a formal inquiry into your credentials, he said. The classified designation on your program documentation is unusual. Classifications often are. It makes verification difficult, and the board's position is that unverifiable credentials don't satisfy our liability requirements. The credentials are verifiable, Nora said. They just require the right channels, which you won't provide, which I can't provide unilaterally. That's how classification works. Farrow tapped a finger once on his desk, a small motion that conveyed a large impatience. The board meeting is at 10 o'clock this morning. Dr. Holt's assessment will be presented. My recommendation is that the current treatment approach has produced insufficient documented progress to justify the continued liability exposure. The dog ate for the first time in 6 days this morning. His food dish was empty. That's one data point. It's a significant one. Nurse Vance, he let the title do its work again. I'm telling you, as a courtesy, what is going to happen at 10 o'clock. I'm not asking for your response to it. I'm informing you. Nora looked at him. Not with anger. She'd learned years ago that anger in these moments cost more than it gained. She looked at him with the specific steadiness of someone who has been in situations where managing their own expression was the difference between the mission continuing or not. I appreciate the courtesy, she said. I'll be at the board meeting. Farrow's composure flickered, just slightly. It's a closed session. The contractor agreement includes a provision for treatment consultation in active case decisions. I'll be there. She stood. Is there anything else? He said nothing. She left. It's out. The board meeting was in a fourth-floor conference room with glass walls and a view of the parking lot that Nora noticed now included, at the far edge near the access road, a dark blue sedan that hadn't been there yesterday and had government plates she recognized the format of from a long distance. She filed that away and sat down. There were 7 people at the table. Marsh, the hospital director, a man in his early 60s with the haircut of someone who'd made a decision about how he presented authority and stuck to it for 20 years. Farrow, Holt, Price from administration, 2 board members she didn't recognize, and a hospital attorney named Dina Sowers, who had the specific alertness of someone being paid to notice things that could become problems later. Marsh opened the meeting by not acknowledging Nora's presence, which was its own kind of statement. Holt presented first. Her assessment was thorough, clinically precise, and carefully framed. The dog's trauma response was severe. Existing protocols had been ineffective. The current approach was unorthodox and, this was the word she used twice, unverified. She presented 3 alternative options, all of which involved either deep sedation for extended stabilization or transfer to a specialized facility in Virginia. She did not mention that the animal had eaten that morning because she hadn't been in the annex yet, and no one had told her. Nora said, when Holt finished, "He ate this morning, full dish." The room turned to look at her. "That's not in the assessment," Marsh said. "It happened at approximately 6:30 a.m., after I established a secondary contact response using a personal effects scent marker from his handler's service record. That's a method from the trauma rehabilitation framework I was trained in, and it's documented in the program literature, which is currently under review for declassification." She kept her voice even. Not defensive, informational. The board should have complete information before making a permanent decision. Holt's expression had the quality of someone recalculating. That approach, using handler personal effects, isn't standard. No, it's advanced. The distinction landed in the room. Sowers, the attorney, said, "Ms. Vance, is the declassification review, you mentioned something that can be confirmed independently? It was initiated last night. The relevant authority can confirm it." "Who is the relevant authority?" "That's part of what's under review," Nora said. "But if the board wants to make a permanent decision before confirmation arrives, that's the board's prerogative." The implication was clear. Make the wrong call now, explain it later. Marsh clasped his hands on the table. He was a man who had learned to read rooms the way executives learn to read rooms. Not the content of what was being said, but the weight distribution. Who had leverage, and how much? He said, "We'll table the final decision until noon." Farrow looked at him. "Director." "Until noon," Marsh repeated. "That." Nora went back to the annex. Ghost was awake when she came in, sitting up, watching the door. When she entered, his tail moved, not the full exuberant wag of a healthy dog. One single sweep, low, close to the floor, the kind of gesture that costs something to make. She sat in the chair. She didn't say anything for a while. The morning passed in a specific kind of quiet. Hospital sounds leaked through the walls, distant PA calls, cartwheels, the occasional sharp voice of someone redirecting someone else. Inside the annex, it was separate from all that. The light was different, the air was different, and something in the quality of the silence had changed overnight. Yesterday, it had been the silence of an animal waiting for the worst. Today, it was something else. At 9:20, Nora opened the enclosure door. She didn't go in. She opened it, latched it open, and went back to her chair and sat down. Ghost looked at the open door. He looked at her. He looked at the door again. He stood up. He walked to the threshold and stopped. His front paws were inside, back paws outside. He stood there for a full 2 minutes, and Nora didn't move and didn't speak, and the two of them existed in that suspended moment together. The dog deciding something, the woman letting him decide it. He stepped through. He walked directly to her chair and pressed his head against her knee and stood there with his full weight leaning into her leg, and she put one hand on the back of his neck and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because some things are complete without language. She was aware, in a distant, practical way, that this was the moment she needed witnessed. She was aware that Reuben had come in for his handoff at 9 and was probably somewhere in the building. She was aware that the board meeting was still ongoing upstairs and that noon was 3 hours away and that the dark blue car in the parking lot was probably still there. She was also aware that none of that mattered as much as the fact that Ghost was standing next to her with his breathing slow and his body weight settled. And for the first time since Daniel Voss died, this dog was in contact with another human being without flinching. Nora had been in combat zones. She'd worked triage in conditions that most people with medical degrees had never encountered and would never encounter. She had a scar on her left forearm from a situation she didn't discuss in professional contexts. She had a capacity for compartmentalization that had been described by a military psychologist once as impressively functional and probably eventually unsustainable. Her eyes were not dry. She didn't make anything of it. She just sat there, one hand on the back of a dog's neck, and let the moment be what it was. At 10:47 a.m., Devin, the scrub tech from yesterday, came down the east corridor with a cart and glanced through the annex window out of habit, the way you glance at things you've already decided aren't interesting. He stopped. Ghost was sitting next to Nora's chair, not in the enclosure, next to the chair. Nora was making notes in her notebook, and Ghost was watching the room with the alert, calm attention of an animal that had decided where it stood. Devin stood at the window for a long moment. Then he picked up the cart and kept walking, and he didn't say anything to anyone for a while, and the smirk that had been in his voice yesterday was absent when he did start talking again. The call came at 11:15, not to Nora's cell, to the main administrative line at Greystone Valley, routed to Marsh's office, from a number that the system flagged as a federal exchange. Marsh took it himself because his assistant had the particular instinct, developed over years of working for men in his position, to route flagged calls directly up without asking questions. Marsh was on the phone for 6 minutes. He came out of his office at 11:23 and walked directly to Farrow's door and knocked once and went in without waiting. Nobody in the administrative cluster heard what was said, but they heard the quality of it. The particular register of a conversation between two people where one of them is receiving news that requires immediate recalculation and is not happy about it. Marsh came out alone 4 minutes later. He walked to Price's desk. "Get Sowers," he said. "Now, and find out where Nurse Vance is." Price said, "She's in the annex, I think. Get her up here." Nora had put Ghost back in the enclosure before she went up. Not because she didn't trust him, but because she trusted the institution least of all right now, And an unsecured military working dog was an administrative liability that would hand Farrow an argument she didn't need him to have. Ghost went in without resistance. She latched the door. He lay down facing her, not the wall. She'd noted it. She'd noted everything. Her notebook had 12 pages of observations in the precise telegraphic shorthand she'd learned in field documentation, the kind of writing that was about capturing data points, not narrative, and could be read by anyone with the right training and interpreted in about 90 seconds. She went upstairs. Marsh's conference room had a different population than the morning meeting. Sowers was there. Price, one board member, the older woman who hadn't spoken in the morning session and had the specific quality of attention of someone who speaks rarely and exactly. Farrow was not there. Marsh gestured to a chair. Nora sat. "We received a call from the Department of Defense Medical Operations Office this morning," Marsh said. He had the measured delivery of a man who has decided that the way to handle a situation in which he was wrong is to present the being wrong as a logical progression of events, rather than an error. They've confirmed the existence of a classified trauma rehabilitation program and have initiated a provisional declassification of your personnel file. Nora didn't say anything. Additionally, Marsh continued, we've been advised that this case, Ghost's case, falls under an existing DoD Service Animal Protection designation that requires documented exhaustion of all approved treatment protocols before any termination decision can be executed. "I know," Nora said. "It's in his file." Marsh's expression moved briefly into something that might have been irritation if it hadn't immediately reorganized into administrative neutrality. "The board has voted to extend your treatment window to 72 hours. The termination order has been suspended pending further review." "Thank you." "I want to be clear," Marsh said, "that this hospital's original decision-making was based on the information available at the time." "Director Marsh," Nora said, not unkindly, "I'm not here to argue about the decision-making process. I'm here to help the dog recover. That's the whole of it." The older board member, a woman named Ruth Gallagher, who had served on the Greystone Valley Board for 11 years and had a son who'd done 2 tours in Iraq, looked at Nora for a moment with an expression that had nothing administrative in it. "Is he going to be okay?" Gallagher asked. The question was different from the ones that had been asked all morning. It wasn't about liability or credentials or protocols. It was a person asking about an animal who had served and was hurting. Nora looked at her directly. "I think so. He needs time and he needs consistency. But this morning he made contact voluntarily. That's significant." Gallagher nodded once. She didn't say anything else. Marsh cleared his throat. "We'll need daily documentation submitted to Dr. Holt for the board's records." "Fine." "And the personal effects you're using, the scent marker, the photograph. Those aren't hospital-issued materials. There may be protocol questions about—" "They're mine," Nora said. "I'll take full responsibility for them." The meeting ended. In the corridor outside, Sowers caught up with her. "For what it's worth," Sowers said, keeping her voice low, "I flagged the liability exposure on the termination order yesterday afternoon, before the DoD call." Nora looked at her. "I told Marsh it was premature. He didn't disagree exactly, but Farrow was pushing." Sowers paused. "I'm not excusing the process. I just wanted you to know it wasn't unanimous." "Okay," Nora said. Sowers seemed to have expected more of a response than that. She said, "What you did this morning, with the enclosure door, someone told me. It wasn't a complicated decision. It could have gone badly." "It could have," Nora agreed, "but I knew it wouldn't." Sowers looked at her with the slightly frustrated expression of someone trying to categorize a person who doesn't fit any existing category. "How did you know?" Nora thought about how to answer that honestly without being precious about it. "You spend enough time with trauma, human or animal. You learn to read the difference between danger and grief. Ghost was never dangerous. He was just in pain. Those aren't the same thing." Sowers held that for a moment. Then she said, "Dr. Farrow is going to be a problem." "I expect so. He's been on the phone since the board meeting ended. I don't know with who." "I have a reasonable guess," Nora said. She went back to the annex. Farrow's calls, as it turned out, were to 3 people. The research institution in Maryland that had sent Holt, a colleague at another hospital system who had contacts in DoD administrative channels, and a legal consultant he occasionally used for professional disputes. He was not panicking. He was a man who had spent 30 years building a structure of professional authority, and he understood at a visceral level that the structure was under stress. His response to stress was systematic. Locate the leverage point, apply counterpressure, reassert control before the situation became a public record he couldn't manage. The problem was that the leverage point kept moving. The classified file was being declassified. That removed the credential uncertainty. The dog had eaten and made voluntary contact, which addressed the no measurable progress argument. The DoD protection designation had been invoked, which removed the termination timeline. Each time Pharaoh closed one line of attack, another had already been rendered unavailable. He sat in his office at 1 p.m. and looked at his hands and did the calculation of a man who was used to winning and was beginning to understand that the current situation was not one he could win through the methods that had always worked before. He called Holt. "Your assessment," he said when she picked up. "The unverified framing. I need you to stand by it." Holt was quiet for a moment. "Elliot, she got the dog out of the enclosure this morning. Under conditions that weren't, documented, she documented everything. I looked at her notebook." A pause. "I've seen a lot of people work with traumatized animals. What she did this morning was not basic. I used the wrong word." Pharaoh held the phone. "I think you need to let this one go," Holt said. He hung up. The afternoon moved differently from the morning. Word had traveled, it always did, and the quality of attention in the East Corridor had shifted. Staff who passed the annex window were slowing down, glancing in, not with the smirking curiosity of the day before. Something else. The kind of attention that forms around something that has turned out to be different from what people expected. Nora worked through the afternoon with the same method: presence, incrementalism, no force. She introduced a second contact point, a piece of equipment from the duffel she'd been holding back, a worn leather lead with a specific smell and weight that Ghost recognized immediately. Not because it was identical to his handler's equipment, because it was related to it. From the same program, the same protocol family, the same world that Ghost had lived in for 6 years. She clipped the lead to his collar, not pulling it, not leading him anywhere, just the weight of it. And Ghost stood very still for a moment, then turned to look at the lead, then turned to look at Nora. "I know," she said. "It's not the same." He put his nose against her hand and exhaled. She walked him to the end of the lead and back. Then again, not a rehabilitation exercise in any formal sense, just movement, just two beings in the same space navigating it together, which was the whole foundation of everything that came after in working dog trauma recovery. You built trust on motion before you built it on stillness, because motion was honest in a way that stillness could fake. Ruben came in at 3 p.m. and stopped in the doorway and watched for a minute. "That's different," he said. "Yes. He's walking with you." "He chose to." Ruben nodded. He had the look of a man who wanted to say something and was deciding whether it was his place. Then he said it anyway, because he was old enough to have stopped waiting for the right place. "Some of the staff are talking. About you. About yesterday and this morning." "What are they saying?" "Different things." He paused. "Devin, from the supply room. He came to me this morning and said he was wrong. What he said to you yesterday. Asked me if he should say it to you directly." He watched her face. "I told him that was his decision to make." Nora kept walking Ghost through a slow turn. "What do you think?" "I think an apology that costs you something is worth something," Ruben said. "One that doesn't cost you anything is just noise." Ghost stopped walking and turned to look at Ruben. A direct, calm assessment, the kind of look that working dogs give people they're deciding about. Ruben held very still. "He's not going to do anything," Nora said. "He's just reading you." "What's he deciding?" "Whether you're safe." Ruben looked at the dog for a moment. "And?" Ghost turned her away and walked to the end of the lead. "You passed," Nora said. Ruben made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had been willing to commit fully. He went back to his cart. At 4:30, Dr. Holt came to the annex. She came alone. No Pharaoh, no administrative backup. She stood in the doorway and watched Nora working with Ghost. They were into a more structured movement pattern now, Nora using hand signals that Holt didn't recognize from any standard protocol. And after a few minutes, Holt said, "Can I ask what those signals are?" Operational commands from his original training program, adapted for rehabilitation context. "You were in that program?" "Yes." "The program that trained him?" "Yes." Holt crossed her arms, but not defensively, the posture of someone thinking rather than protecting. "So you didn't just know how to work with a dog like him in general. You knew him specifically, his exact training vocabulary." Nora looked at her. "Not exactly. Different unit, but the same framework. That's why he responded when no one else could get near him. Part of why." Holt was quiet for a moment. In the enclosure, Ghost had gone back in on his own when Nora unclipped the lead, which was itself a significant behavioral data point. Ghost was lying with his head up, watching both of them. "I want to redo the assessment," Holt said, "with complete information this time." "Okay. I need you to walk me through what you're doing and why. The full clinical reasoning. That's going to involve some background that isn't yet in any public literature. I'll sign a confidentiality agreement if that's what it takes." Holt paused. "I was wrong this morning. Not about the methodology. That was genuinely unclear, but about the framing I used." Nora looked at her steadily. "I appreciate that. I'm not saying it for your benefit. I'm saying it because if it affects the board's decision and I didn't correct it, that's my problem." "Still," Nora said. "Thank you." They stood in parallel for a moment, two people who were skilled in different dimensions of the same problem, recalibrating around each other. "How long has he been with you today?" Holt asked. "About 9 hours total. And the progress in 9 hours is more than 6 days of the previous approach." "Yes." Holt uncrossed her arms. "When can we do the full walkthrough?" "Tomorrow morning, early. 6:30? 6:30 is fine." Holt left. Nora stood at the enclosure door for a moment, looking at Ghost. He met her gaze with that steady, exhausted, slowly reopening attention. "One more day," she told him quietly, "and then it gets complicated." She didn't know, yet, exactly how right she was. At 5:50 p.m., a nurse named Alicia from the 4th floor came down to the annex on her break. She was 26 and had heard about the morning from Terrence, who had heard about it from Pete, who had told the version that was accurate but understated in the way that accurate versions sometimes are. Alicia had gone to nursing school with people who'd served, and she had a particular feeling about what she was going to find in the annex that she couldn't justify clinically, but trusted anyway. She stood at the window for a minute. Ghost was lying down near the door of his enclosure. Nora was at her chair writing. The room had a quality of settled attention that Alicia had encountered exactly twice in her career. Once in a pediatric unit during a long night, and once with a dying patient who'd finally stopped being afraid. It was not peace, exactly. It was the state just before peace, when the worst of the tension has left, but the ease hasn't fully arrived. She was about to walk away when Nora looked up and saw her through the window. They looked at each other for a moment. Nora nodded once. Alicia nodded back and went back to her floor. She went to the break room and sent a text to Terrence. "It's real. Whatever she's doing, it's real." At 6:40 p.m., Nora's phone buzzed with a text from the number with no area code. "Declassification confirmed. Full file will be available to authorized facility personnel by 800 tomorrow. You should know. There's a convoy being coordinated. Not my call. Someone above me wanted it done in person." Nora read it twice. Then, "How many vehicles?" The reply came back in under a minute. 3, plus a senior officer. They want to be there for the record release. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at the parking lot through the small high window of the annex. The dark blue sedan was still there. It had been there for 12 hours. They'd been waiting, she thought, since this morning. She thought about what that meant. Someone senior enough to command a 3-vehicle convoy, patient enough to wait in a parking lot all day without announcing themselves. Waiting not for the dog's recovery. Waiting for her. She thought about the last time she'd been in a room with senior military officers, and the circumstances under which she'd left that world, and the specific feeling of walking away from something you were good at because the cost of staying had become a kind that couldn't be counted in career terms. She was still thinking about it when she heard the sound. It wasn't loud. It was, in fact, very quiet. The specific acoustic signature of a lateral impact against a hard surface in the annex. She turned. Ghost was standing at the front of his enclosure, weight forward, ears up, staring at the annex door with the particular attention of a working dog that has detected something at the edge of its sensory range. Not threat display, not the panic response she'd seen in his file. Recognition. She heard footsteps in the corridor, 2 pairs, maybe 3. The weight distribution of people who walked in a specific way. The way people walked when they'd been trained to move quietly and efficiently, and the habit had become so deep it was indistinguishable from their normal gait. Ghost made a sound, low, a single note, not aggressive. The annex door opened. The man who came through it was in his early 50s, silver-haired at the temples, wearing civilian clothes, dark slacks, gray jacket, but carrying himself with the kind of structured authority that civilian clothes couldn't entirely contain. Behind him were 2 younger people, a man and a woman, also civilian-dressed, same quality of bearing. The older man looked at Nora. He looked at Ghost. He looked back at Nora. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded document that she recognized. She would have recognized the format from across a room in poor light. She'd spent enough years handling them. "Captain Vance," he said. His voice was quiet, measured, the voice of a man who used titles precisely. "We need to talk." Ghost pressed against the front of his enclosure, tail moving in slow, deliberate sweeps, nose working toward the silver-haired man with an intensity that meant something very specific. And in the pocket of the silver-haired man's jacket, visible now as he shifted to hand Nora the document, was the corner of a sealed envelope. A letter. Handwritten name on the outside. In handwriting Nora recognized. Daniel Voss had written it, and the name on the front was not the silver-haired officer's. It was hers. Her name, in Daniel Voss's handwriting, on an envelope that had traveled from a forward operating area to a government office to a silver-haired officer's jacket pocket to this annex in Delford, Pennsylvania. Nora didn't reach for it immediately. The silver-haired man, he hadn't given his name yet, which was itself information, held the document out to her first. She took it. A single page. Official letterhead, DOD seal at the top. She read it in about 15 seconds. It was a formal notification of her personnel file's provisional declassification, effective 0800 the following morning. Below that, 2 lines she hadn't expected, a reinstatement offer to the trauma rehabilitation program she'd left, and a directive, not a request, a directive, requiring her presence at a formal review of the program's operational protocols within 30 days. She folded it. "I'm Colonel Marcus Webb," the silver-haired man said. "I ran the program for the last 4 years. Before that, I was the supervising officer when you were embedded with 7 Alpha." Nora looked at him. "I remember." "I know you do." He glanced at Ghost, who was watching him from the enclosure with that specific quality of recognition, not from Webb personally, she realized, but from Webb's clothing, his bearing, the residual markers of the operational world Ghost had lived in. Daniel sent that letter 3 weeks before the ambush. It was sealed, held with his service effects, and routed to me when his effects were processed. Why you? Because he addressed the outer envelope to me with a note that said to hold it until Ghost chose someone. Webb paused. His words, not mine. He was specific about it. The younger woman behind Webb, Nora now clocked her as late 30s, likely a program coordinator based on how she was holding a sealed case file, shifted her weight. The man beside her was watching the enclosure, not the conversation. "He knew I'd come," Nora said. "It wasn't a question. He wrote your name in the outer envelope note. Said if anything happened to him, Ghost would need someone who'd been inside the program. He listed 3 people. The other 2 are deployed." Webb looked at her steadily. "He listed you first." Nora put the folded document in her jacket pocket. She needed a moment with that. Daniel had known her for 2 years during her program rotation, known her professionally, known her well enough to know what she was capable of. And in the weeks before he died, facing whatever he'd been facing, He'd thought about his dog and written her name first on a list. That was going to cost her something, emotionally, to fully absorb. Not now. "I'll take the letter," she said. Webb reached into his pocket and held it out. She took it without opening it. She'd read it later alone, which was the only appropriate way to read something like that. "The review directive," she said. "The 30-day protocol review. That's not optional." "No." "And the reinstatement offer?" "Also not optional in its current framing," Webb said. "The program is being restructured. What you've done here in 40 hours is going to be part of the new case literature. The board that approved the declassification wants it documented formally." Nora looked at him. "I left the program for a reason." "I know why you left." "Then you know the reason hasn't changed." Webb was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of a man who had prepared for this specific conversation and was now discovering that the preparation hadn't accounted for the actual person. "The conditions that made you leave have changed, structurally. That's part of what the review is about." "I'll read the directive," Nora said. "That's all I'm committing to tonight." Webb nodded. He wasn't pressing. She noted that the decision not to push, which was either respect or strategy, and with people at his level, it was usually both simultaneously. Ghost made a sound from the enclosure. All 4 people looked at him. He was standing, tail moving, nose pointed at Webb with that particular intensity that wasn't aggression. "He knows you're from the same world," Nora said. "Is that what that is?" "It's more than that, but yes." Webb looked at the dog for a long moment. Something crossed his face. Not sentiment exactly, but its functional neighbor. "Daniel talked about him constantly, drove the rest of the unit insane." He paused. "Good kid. Exceptional medic." "Yes," Nora said, just the one word. It held everything it needed to. They were in the annex for 22 minutes. When they left, they used the east exit, not the main lobby, and the dark blue sedan pulled out of the parking lot 20 minutes later. But the convoy Webb had mentioned wasn't gone. It had moved to a position on the access road that wasn't visible from the hospital entrance. Waiting. Nora knew what they were waiting for. She also knew, as she stood in the annex with Ghost's lead in her hand and the sealed letter in her jacket, that the next 12 hours were the fulcrum point of the entire situation. The declassification went live at 800. The board had been given a 72-hour extension, but Pharaoh's calls that afternoon hadn't stopped at 3 people. She knew his type well enough to know that. He was building something. She just didn't know yet what shape it was taking. She found out at 8:15 p.m. from Alicia, who texted her from the 4th floor. "Pharaoh's been meeting with 2 of the board members privately. One of them is Walsh. Someone's filing a formal misconduct complaint against your contractor credentials tomorrow morning, before the declassification goes live. The timing was not accidental. If a formal misconduct complaint was filed before 800, it created an administrative hold on her contractor status that would take 48 hours minimum to resolve, even after the file cleared. 48 hours in which the termination order could be reinstated on liability grounds, because she'd be operating under contested credentials. Ghost would be dead before the hold resolved. She stood in the annex for a moment, thinking through the geometry of it. Pharaoh wasn't stupid. He'd found the one window left in a situation that had closed every other window, and he was going to use it. She called the number with no area code. It rang once. "The timing on the complaint," she said. "I need the declassification moved up." A pause. "That's not a simple... I know it's not simple. I'm telling you what I need. If the file clears before the complaint is filed, the complaint has no standing. If it files first, I lose 48 hours, and he loses his life." A longer pause. She heard someone in the background, muffled. "I'll see what can be done," the voice said. "No guarantees." "I know." She hung up. She looked at Ghost. He was watching her with his head tilted slightly, the particular angle of a dog parsing tone of voice without having language for it, reading her the way she'd been reading him. "We're not done yet," she told him. At 9:45 p.m., Nora did something she hadn't done yet. She went to find Pharaoh. Not because she thought she could change his mind. She'd given up on that possibility around the time Holt called him, and he'd asked Holt to stand by an assessment Holt had already walked back. This wasn't about changing his mind. It was about documentation. Specifically, she needed him on record, in person, stating his position clearly enough that it could be accurately described later. She found him on the second floor, coming out of the physician's lounge with a phone pressed to his ear. He saw her. His conversation stopped mid-sentence. He said something quiet into the phone and hung up. "Nurse Vance?" "Dr. Farrow." She kept her hands in her pockets. Not aggressive, not submissive. Level. "I wanted to speak with you directly before tomorrow." He waited. "I know about the complaint," she said. "I'm not here to talk you out of it. You're going to make whatever decision you're going to make. I wanted you to know, face to face, that it won't work. Not in the way you're hoping." Farrow's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you think you—" "The file clears at 0800. Whatever is filed before that will need to clear the same DOD channel that initiated the declassification. That's not a routine administrative path. That's a protected military personnel matter." He looked at her. She could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment of a man who had been given different information by whatever consultant he'd spoken to that afternoon. "You're bluffing," he said. "I'm not, but I understand why you'd think so." She looked at him steadily. "You've been in this hospital for 16 years. You've built something real here. I'm not your enemy, Dr. Farrow. I'm a temporary contractor trying to keep a dog alive." Something shifted in his face. Not enough to call it anything yet, but a movement. "You dismissed a situation you didn't have full information about," she said. "That happens. What happens after that is the part that matters." He said nothing. "Ghost ate twice today," she said. "He walked with me on a lead. He made voluntary contact and maintained it. That's not luck and it's not coincidence. It's a specific methodology working on a specific patient. The record will show that clearly." Farrow looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, his expression had the particular quality of a man who had been very certain about something and was now, unwillingly and without any satisfaction, becoming less certain. "The complaint," he said. "It's already been drafted." "I know." Filing it was the recommendation of legal counsel. "Legal counsel who didn't know about the protected channel," Nora said. "Now you do." He looked at her for a long moment. "If I don't file it, then tomorrow morning the file clears, the board has full documentation of Ghost's progress, and the termination order stays suspended. Everybody moves forward. And the misconduct review into my handling of this case." Nora paused. That was a different question, one she hadn't brought up, one he'd raised himself, which meant he already knew it was coming. "That's separate from the complaint question. That process exists regardless." "I know." He said it flatly, not angry, the flatness of a man receiving a bill he'd already decided he could pay. She left him in the corridor. Well, at 11:58 p.m., her phone buzzed, the number with no area code. "File clearance has been moved to 0600. Confirmation in the system by 0530. She exhaled slowly. Then, 1 minute later, a second text from a different number. Alicia's. "Farrow just called Walsh. Don't know what he said." Walsh just left the building. Nora stared at that for a moment. Farrow calling Walsh could mean the complaint was canceled, or it could mean something had changed that she hadn't accounted for. The problem with a situation that had been moving this fast was that she'd been one step ahead the whole time, and one step ahead was not the same as safe. She went to the annex. Ghost was awake. He stood when she came in, walked to the enclosure door, and pressed his nose against it. She put her hand flat against the wire. "Almost," she said. He stayed there. She pulled out Daniel Voss's letter. She stood for a long moment with it in her hands. The paper had the slightly thickened feel of something that had been handled carefully for weeks, kept in a dry environment, treated like what it was. She looked at her name in his handwriting. She opened it. She read it once. She folded it back along the same creases and put it in her inside pocket, against her chest, and stood very still for a moment. Ghost made a low sound. "I know," she said. Her voice wasn't entirely steady. She let it be what it was. "I know." She was still standing there at 12:34 a.m. when her phone rang. Not a text, a call, from a number she didn't recognize. She answered. "Is this Nora Vance?" A woman's voice. Young, strained, the specific vocal quality of someone trying to hold themselves together over a phone line. Yes. My name is Simone Voss. Daniel was my brother. A pause. Colonel Webb gave me your number. He said Ghost is alive, that you're there with him. The silence between them had weight. He's alive, Nora said. He's going to be okay. Simone Voss made a sound on the other end of the line that was not a sob exactly, but its compressed antecedent. The sound of something that had been braced against grief suddenly finding a corner that didn't require bracing. He was all Daniel talked about, she said, in the last call. 3 days before. He said, if anything happened, make sure Ghost was okay. He made me promise. He's okay, Nora said. He's eating. He walked with me today. Another silence. The letter, Simone said. Did you read it? Yes. He told me he wrote you one. He said... She stopped. Started again. He said you'd understand it. Nora looked at Ghost through the wire. I do. Will you... Simone's voice broke across a single syllable and recovered. Will you tell me? Not the whole thing, just... Was he scared? At the end? The letter. Does it say? Nora stood very still in the annex with an 18-year military career and a sealed letter in her chest pocket, and a dog pressing his forehead against wire on the other side of a door. And she thought about how to be honest in a way that was also kind, which had always been the hardest calculation she'd ever had to make. No, she said. He wasn't scared. She heard Simone breathe. He was thinking about Ghost, Nora said. And about you. What she did not say, what she would carry in that inside pocket for a long time, was what the last paragraph of Daniel Voss's letter had actually said. What he'd written about Ghost's recovery. About who Ghost would choose, and why, and what that choice would mean. What he'd written about the program. About Nora specifically. About what he'd seen that she'd never seen in herself. She was still standing there, phone against her ear, when the annex lights flickered. Once. Twice. Then the backup generator kicked in with a mechanical thud that shook the east wall. And in the half-second of darkness between normal power and backup, every electronic lock in the veterinary annex disengaged. Ghost's enclosure door swung open. The darkness lasted 4 seconds. Nora was already moving before the backup generator finished cycling. She said, "Hold on," into the phone and pocketed it without ending the call. Simone was still there. She could sort that out later. And crossed the annex in 3 steps. Ghost was standing in the open enclosure door. Not running. Not panicking. Standing in the threshold the same way he'd stood that morning when she'd unlatched it. Weight distributed, assessing. He looked at Nora. He looked at the annex door behind her. He looked back at Nora. "Stay," she said. The word was quiet, flat, the specific register of a command that assumes compliance rather than demanding it. Ghost sat. The backup lights came fully on, amber-toned, lower than the main fluorescence, which made the annex feel smaller. Nora went to the enclosure and checked the latch mechanism. The electronic component had disengaged during the power interruption. The manual backup was still functional, which meant the door had swung on its own weight rather than any deliberate release. Maintenance issue. Old building. She'd noted the latch felt loose yesterday morning and hadn't reported it because she'd been focused on other things, which was now clearly a mistake. She latched the enclosure. Ghost watched the process with patient attention. "Good," she told him. She went back to her phone. "I'm here," she said. "Sorry. Power issue. Everything's fine." Simone Voss on the other end sounded like she'd been holding her breath. "Is he okay?" "He's fine. He sat on command. That's actually significant." A shaky exhale. "He's really going to be okay." "Yes." Nora leaned against the supply cabinet. The adrenaline from the 4 seconds of darkness was still working its way out of her system, which was embarrassing and human, and she let it be both. "I should let you sleep. It's late." "I can't sleep." Simone paused. "I haven't slept since they called me about Daniel. It's been..." She calculated. 13 days. Nora knew what 13 days of that felt like, not from Daniel specifically, but from the category of loss. She'd been in it before, come through the other side in one piece, mostly through stubbornness and the inconvenient persistence of the work. "I know," she said. "Do you think—" Simone started, stopped, started again. "Is there any chance I could see him? Ghost. At some point. When he's better." "I'll make sure it happens," Nora said. She meant it, which was the only way she said things. It. She was there when Ruben arrived at midnight for the overnight handoff, and she told him about the latch and watched him test it twice and note it in the maintenance log with the specificity of a man who understood that small things written down became important facts later. "Power blip hit the whole east wing," Ruben said. "Transformer issue. Facilities is already on it." "How often does that happen?" "Used to be once a month before the renovation, maybe twice a year now." He tested the latch a third time. "I'll put in a request for a manual override secondary. Should have been there from the start." Nora nodded. She looked at Ghost, who had settled into his sleeping position, the full C-curl, but now oriented toward the enclosure door rather than the back wall. A small thing. Not nothing. She left at 12:50 a.m. and drove to the motel in the particular silence of someone who has too many simultaneous thoughts to organize any of them. She didn't try. She took a shower, ate the rest of a sandwich she'd bought at noon and forgotten about, and lay down with Daniel's letter on the nightstand. She didn't open it again. She'd read it twice. She'd read it enough. What he'd written about the program, about the framework she'd built, about what Ghost's choice of her would mean, wasn't something she could process in a motel room at 1 a.m. That would take longer. It would take the kind of time that only opens up when the immediate situation has resolved and you can finally afford to sit with something instead of moving through it. She set an alarm for 5 a.m. and was asleep within minutes, which was not a skill everyone had. And she had it because her body had learned over years of operational tempo that sleep was not optional and could not be negotiated with. At 5:17 a.m., her phone buzzed. Clearance confirmed in the system. "File is live as of 5:30. You're clean." She was already awake, already dressed. The hospital at 5:45 a.m. had its own particular character. Skeleton staff, dimmer ambient noise, the feeling of an institution between versions of itself. Nora badged through the east corridor and went to the annex and found Ghost awake and standing, which she took as a good sign. His food from the night had been consumed. Ruben's overnight note on the clipboard outside said, "Ate full portion at 02:30. No distress events. Calm overnight." She sat with Ghost for 40 minutes before anyone else arrived. No lead, no exercises, just presence, which was still doing the work it had been doing since the beginning, the animal equivalent of a human sitting with someone and not trying to fix anything. At 6:28 a.m., Holt arrived 2 minutes early, with a legal pad and the expression of someone who had decided overnight what kind of professional she was going to be going forward. They worked for 2 hours. Nora walked Holt through the methodology in the precise technical terms it deserved. The framework's origins, the specific trauma staging system, the sensory marker approach, and why it worked for working dogs in handler-lost states, the command vocabulary, and how it connected to Ghost's original training. She answered every question directly. When Holt pushed back on something, twice, Nora engaged with the pushback rather than overriding it, because Holt had good instincts even when she didn't have complete information, and good instincts deserved a real response. Holt filled 14 pages of notes. At one point, watching Ghost respond to a hand signal with the clean compliance of an animal that had crossed back over some internal threshold, Holt said, "How long have you been doing this?" "The military version? 7 years? The leaving it and coming back to it version? This is the first time." "Is it what you expected?" Nora considered that. "No, I expected it to be harder." "It's been 40 hours. "I know. I expected it to be harder inside, the work. But Ghost?" She stopped. "He wanted to come back. He just needed someone to show him it was available." Holt wrote something. That's a useful way to frame it for the case literature. It's just true. At 8:15 a.m., Holt's phone buzzed. She read the notification. Then she looked at Nora. The personnel file cleared. I know. The board is convening at 9, full session. Marsh wants everyone there. Holt paused. Farrow included. The conference room at 9 was different from the day before, in a way that had less to do with who was present and more to do with the weight of what everyone in it now knew. Marsh sat at the head of the table. Farrow was there, positioned at the far end, which might have been coincidence and wasn't. Holt beside Nora. Sowers, the attorney. Gallagher, the board member who'd asked the real question 2 days ago. 3 additional board members who hadn't been in the previous session. And Webb, Colonel Marcus Webb, in civilian clothes, seated along the wall as an observer, which was technically his status and practically something else entirely. Marsh opened by presenting the personnel file clearance as if it were new information to the room, which it wasn't for most people present, but procedure required its presentation, so it was presented. Captain Nora Vance, formerly of the Army's Combat Trauma Rehabilitation Program, author or co-author of 4 classified research papers on working animal post-combat recovery, decorated for 2 field deployments, and 1 specific operational situation that was summarized in 1 sentence of bureaucratic language that contained within it, for anyone who knew how to read it, something that Farrow had never expected to be sitting across from. She had, on 1 occasion, managed a trauma stabilization situation under direct fire with 2 injured soldiers and a handler-bonded military working dog, with 0 losses, in conditions that the summary described as severely resource-limited. Farrow read it. Nora watched him read it. He looked up from the document. He looked across the table. She didn't look away. The meeting moved forward. Holt presented her revised assessment. Thorough, honest. The complete reversal of the unverified framing, documented with 14 pages of clinical observation from the morning session and 2 days of progress notes. Ghost status, critical to stable. Prognosis. Full behavioral recovery possible within 4 to 6 weeks of continued supervised rehabilitation. Termination grounds. No longer clinically or ethically supportable. Marsh asked for the board's position. 5 votes in favor of permanent suspension of the termination order. Gallagher made it 6. The 7th board member, a man named Pratt, who had been exchanging brief glances with Farrow throughout the meeting, abstained. The order was suspended. Then Marsh put a second item on the table. The board has also reviewed the conduct record for this case from initial intake through present, Marsh said. He was not looking at Farrow. He was looking at the center of the table with the practiced neutrality of someone delivering something they'd rather not deliver, but understood was unavoidable. Dr. Holt's original assessment included language that was not supported by complete information. Dr. Holt has acknowledged this and submitted a formal correction. The board finds that the original assessment, as submitted, contributed materially to the liability arguments used to justify the termination timeline. Holt said quietly, "I've submitted the correction and a formal letter of acknowledgement to the board. It's on record." "Thank you," Marsh said. He paused. The board also finds that the access restrictions placed on contractor Vance in the first 24 hours, specifically the delay in credential activation and the treatment access limitations, created an unnecessary risk to the patient. He paused again. The word patient applied to Ghost didn't raise any eyebrows, which said something about how far the room had moved. These restrictions originated from the office of the senior physician overseeing the annex. Farrow's expression was controlled. She had to give him that. He'd had 12 hours to prepare for this moment, and he'd prepared for it the way he prepared for everything, with structure, with a maintained surface. But structure and surface were not the same as being okay, and he was not okay, and the room knew it. A formal misconduct review has been initiated, Marsh said. It covers the credential obstruction, the treatment access limitation, and the communication to outside parties regarding the case. That last part was new information. Nora had not known about the communication to outside parties piece. She filed it away. Dr. Farrow has been placed on administrative leave effective this morning pending the review outcome. Farrow said nothing. Pratt, the board member who'd abstained from the dog vote, said, "For the record, I want to note that Dr. Farrow's position was based on the information available to, it's noted, Marsh said, in the tone of someone noting something they intend to forget quickly. The meeting ended. Gadkit. In the corridor afterward, Pharaoh was standing near the elevator with a posture Nora recognized. The specific set of a person who has been reduced from one version of themselves to a smaller version in public and hasn't yet found the route back to dignity. She'd seen it before. Not often, but enough. She almost walked past him. She stopped. Dr. Pharaoh. He looked at her. His control was still there. He hadn't lost it, which she respected even now because control under pressure was something she understood the cost of. I misjudged you, he said. It came out flat. Not contrite exactly, but accurate, which was the version of honesty available to people who weren't good at the other kind. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. You dismissed me. He held that. Is there a difference? Misjudging is about information. You didn't have enough. You reached the wrong conclusion. She kept her voice even. Dismissing is a decision you make before the information arrives. You'd already decided what I was before you knew anything about me. Pharaoh didn't dispute it. The review is going to happen regardless, she said. But what happens after, it is still up to you. There's a difference between how you got here and what you do from here. He looked at her with the expression of a man being given a latitude he hadn't expected and wasn't sure he'd earned. You're not angry. I don't have room for it, she said, which was true. I have a dog to rehabilitate. She left him at the elevator. She wasn't entirely sure that was the right thing to say or the right way to leave it. Probably there was a version of that conversation she could have handled with more something. Elegance, maybe. But she was tired, and she'd been right about the situation from the beginning, and she hadn't slept enough, and she was still carrying Daniel Voss's letter in her inside pocket. And sometimes the available version of a hard conversation was the practical one rather than the perfect one. She was fine with that. Webb was waiting for her outside the stairwell door. Well handled, he said. I'm not sure it was. That's why it was. He fell into step beside her toward the east corridor. Pharaoh's review is going to be thorough. Sowers has already flagged 3 separate instances of documentation irregularities going back to the program's initial setup at this facility. That's separate from the case. Connected enough that the board will see it as a pattern. Webb paused. That's not your problem to manage. I wanted you to know the full picture. What about Pratt? Webb looked at her sideways. What about him? He abstained. He was watching Pharaoh the whole meeting. Pratt and Pharaoh have a professional history going back about 8 years. Webb's tone indicated he was providing information, not commentary. The board is aware of it now. That's also not your problem. They reached the annex corridor. Nora paused outside the door. The reinstatement, she said, and the review. I'll do the review. The 30-day protocol session. And the reinstatement? She thought about what Daniel had written in the letter, about the framework she'd built, and then walked away from because the institution hadn't been ready for it, about what he'd said would happen if someone with the right standing pushed for it again. The conditions, she said, the structural changes you mentioned. I'll send you the documentation today. If the changes are what you say they are, she stopped. I'm not committing tonight. I know. Webb's voice was not unkind. I've been trying to get you back in the program for 2 years, Captain. I can wait another week. She went into the annex. Ghost stood when she came through the door. He walked to the front of his enclosure and pressed his nose through the wire and made the low chest sound she'd learned to read as a specific register of recognition. Not distress, not demand. Just, you're here. I'm here, she said. She opened the enclosure. He came out. The afternoon was the first time since his arrival at Greystone Valley that Ghost moved through a space like an animal that had somewhere to be. Not frantic. Nothing about him had ever been frantic, even in the worst of the first 6 days, but purposeful. He walked the length of the annex, nose working the air at every corner, cataloging the environment with the systematic thoroughness of a trained working dog establishing a new space. He returned to Nora twice during the circuit, pressing briefly against her leg, then moving on, which was textbook handler-bonded behavior, the specific pattern of an animal that is establishing its orientation anchor. You were the fixed point. Everything else was negotiable. Holt came by at 2 p.m. and stood in the doorway without interrupting. She watched Ghost complete a third circuit, watched him return to Nora, watched Nora's hand rest briefly on his flank without making anything of it. "He's navigating," Holt said quietly. "Yes. It's normal. It's good." Nora didn't take her eyes off Ghost. "He's deciding this is his space now. That means he's accepted that the old space isn't coming back." Holt was quiet for a moment. "How do you know when that's complete?" "He'll stop checking every corner and start checking the door, looking out instead of mapping in." She watched Ghost pause at the far wall and lift his head. "Maybe tomorrow. And then?" "And then we work on what comes next." Down. At 4 p.m., Devon came to the annex. He came alone, without the cart, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before Nora acknowledged him. Ghost looked at him with the calm assessment he gave anyone new. Cataloging, deciding. "I wanted to say something," Devon said. "To you directly, not through Reuben." Nora waited. He wasn't quite meeting her eyes. He was 24 and had been wrong in a way that had cost him something. Not career-wise, nothing that formal, but the internal something that happens when you're confronted with the specific shape of your own assumptions. It was uncomfortable, and he was wearing it clearly, and she gave him credit for showing up anyway. "What I said the other day was, I was being an idiot," he said. "I didn't know what was happening, and I acted like I did." "Okay," Nora said. "I heard about the credentials. What you actually... I didn't know." "You couldn't have," she said. "The file was classified." He looked at her then. "That doesn't make what I said okay." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't, but it explains it." She held his gaze. "How's Marcus?" The question, about the medic, his friend, the one with the fractured wrist, briefly rearranged Devon's expression. He hadn't expected her to ask. "He's okay. Wrist is healing. He's back next week." "Good." Devon nodded. He looked at Ghost, who was sitting near Nora's chair, watching this exchange with the specific attention of an animal that tracks human tension and has decided the current level is acceptable. "He looks different," Devon said. "He is different." Devon nodded again and left. He didn't say anything performative on the way out, didn't wrap it up neatly, just walked away with the slightly humbled gait of someone in the process of deciding who they wanted to be going forward. She could work with that. Most people could, given enough time and enough accurate reflection. But at 6:30 p.m., Webb sent the documentation. 43 pages. She read it in the break room with a cup of Reuben's vending machine coffee going cold beside her. The structural changes were real, not cosmetic, actual procedural and reporting changes, new oversight provisions, an independent review body that hadn't existed when she left. The framework she'd built and then watched sit unused on a shelf because the institutional appetite for it hadn't existed had been formally adopted as the program's central methodology. Her framework. Her 7 years of work. She read to the last page, which contained the list of current program personnel and their active cases. She counted 14 animals in various stages of trauma recovery across 3 facilities. 14 cases that were being handled now using approaches derived from what she'd built. She closed the document. She wasn't going to make the decision tonight. She was going to sleep on it and make it from a clear head, because decisions made from exhaustion and emotion, even good emotion, had a habit of looking different in the morning. She'd learned that lesson twice and didn't need a third time, but she knew what the decision was going to be. Boom. At 8:40 p.m., Sowers called. Not a text. A call, which meant it was something she wanted to say directly. Nora stepped into the corridor outside the annex. "The misconduct review," Sowers said. "It widened this afternoon." "Widened how?" "The communications to outside parties that Marsh mentioned in the meeting. Farrow was in contact with a liability consulting firm over the past 3 days. That's normal enough. But the firm is owned by one of Pratt's former business partners." Nora held the phone. "The concern," Sowers continued, "is that the complaint that was going to be filed this morning, the timing of it, may have originated from that consulting relationship rather than from Farrow's independent judgment, in which case Pratt's abstention this morning takes on a different character." You're saying Pharaoh wasn't acting alone. I'm saying the review board is now looking at that question. A pause. It doesn't change Ghost's status. The termination order is suspended, the extension is in place, your contractor standing is clean, but I thought you should know the full picture. Webb used that phrase this morning. It's an accurate phrase for the situation. Sowers paused again. You should also know that Pratt requested the full personnel file after the meeting. Your file. Not for the board record, a personal request. Marsh denied it. Nora processed that. Pratt requesting her personal file after a meeting where his position had been noted and his connection to Pharaoh flagged was either defensive preparation or something proactive. Neither option was comfortable. What's Pratt's official capacity? Board member 6 years. Before that, hospital administration in a different system in Ohio. He has significant institutional relationships in regional healthcare governance. Sowers' tone was careful. He's not someone who loses reviews quietly. Is this a warning? It's information. Okay. Nora looked through the annex window. Ghost was in his enclosure, lying in the middle of the space rather than the corner. A detail that mattered, a foot of distance that represented several days of work. Thank you for calling directly. One more thing, Sowers said. The documentation irregularities I mentioned earlier, going back to the program's initial setup, one of them involves the original intake record for Ghost. The date of the handler loss notification on file doesn't match the date on the DoD routing documents. Nora went still. What's the discrepancy? The facility file says notification was received 2 days after Ghost arrived. The DoD routing shows it was received the same day, before he was admitted. A beat. Someone in this facility knew Ghost had lost his handler before he came through the doors, Sowers said, and documented it differently. The annex was quiet. That changes the negligence picture entirely, Nora said. Yes, Sowers said. It does. She hung up. She stood in the corridor for a long moment. Through the window, Ghost had lifted his head and was looking at the annex door with the calm, alert attention of an animal that had processed enough threat for one day and was simply waiting to see what came next. Nora had the specific feeling she'd had it before, in operational context, the feeling that arrives when you realize the situation you thought you understood was larger than it appeared, and you are standing in a different part of it than you knew. That the paperwork on Pratt's 6 years on the board and his Ohio background and his business partner's consulting firm and the date discrepancy on Ghost's intake file were not separate threads. They were the same thread, and someone had been pulling it for a long time before she arrived. Her phone buzzed. A text from Webb. I just got a call. Pratt is requesting a special board session tomorrow morning, emergency basis. He cited a procedural violation in the personnel file release. Then, 10 seconds later, a second message. He's claiming the declassification was improper, that the channel used bypassed standard DoD protocol. If he makes it stick, your file goes back under review. She stared at it. The clearance she'd needed moved up to 0530 to beat a complaint. Pratt, who had connections she was only starting to map. A date discrepancy on Ghost's intake that exposed someone in this hospital to serious liability. An emergency session called for tomorrow morning. Not Pharaoh. Pharaoh was on leave. Pharaoh had been the visible problem. Pratt had been the architecture. And Pratt still had a seat at the table. She didn't sleep. Not because she couldn't, her body knew how, but because she made a decision at 9 p.m. in the motel room that sleeping was less useful than thinking, and she was going to give herself 2 hours to think before she committed to either. She sat at the small desk with Webb's 43 pages on one side and her own notebook on the other and worked backward through everything she knew about Pratt. 6 years on the board, Ohio background, business partner connected to the consulting firm Pharaoh had used, a request for her personal file after the morning meeting, an emergency session called for tomorrow on a procedural technicality. The procedural argument he was going to make, that the declassification channel bypassed standard DoD protocol, was not entirely without basis. The channel Webb had used was expedited, which meant it had been routed through a senior authorization level that didn't require the standard 30-day review period. That was legal. It was also unusual enough that someone with the right institutional knowledge could frame it as irregular and get a hearing on that framing. especially in a civilian administrative context where nobody around the table would understand DoD clearance infrastructure well enough to push back in real time. The hearing would create a hold. The hold would re-expose Ghost's termination timeline. And in the 48 hours while the hold resolved, something would happen that Nora couldn't predict yet, which was the part that concerned her most. She picked up her phone and called Webb. He answered on the second ring, which told her he was also awake. "The channel," she said. "Walk me through exactly what authorization was used." "Senior Medical Operations Commander, direct signature. Bypasses the 30-day period under the expedited humanitarian provision. It's been used 11 times in the last 6 years, every one of them legally clean." "But the provision isn't public knowledge." "No." So in a civilian board session, if Pratt argues irregular process, the people in that room won't know the provision exists. "Correct, which is why I'll be there to explain it." An observer explaining DoD clearance process doesn't carry the same weight as a documented precedent, Nora said. "Pratt will know that." Webb was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" "The 11 precedent cases, specifically the documentation showing the provision and its legal basis, in writing, before 9 a.m. I can have it by 6. And the intake date discrepancy. Sowers flagged it, but it needs to be formally submitted before the session. If Pratt is calling the session to distract from the discrepancy, he probably is," Webb said. "Then the discrepancy needs to be already on record before he walks into that room. Otherwise, he controls the agenda." Webb said, "I'll call Sowers. Tonight." "Tonight." A pause. "You've done this before. The institutional version of this." "Once," she said, "in a different context." "Did it work?" She thought about it honestly. "Mostly. The part that didn't was my fault." "What was your fault?" She looked at Daniel's letter on the nightstand. "I waited too long to say what I knew. I thought if I was patient enough, the system would correct itself." "And?" "The system needs people to move it. It doesn't move on its own." She hung up and went back to the notebook and worked until 11 p.m., then set her alarm for 4:30 and lay down. She slept. Sowers submitted the intake date discrepancy to the board record at 7:14 a.m., flagged as a formal documentation irregularity requiring investigation, with a cover note from the legal team recommending the board commission an independent audit of all ghost-related intake records before the emergency session proceeded. That recommendation, submitted in writing before 8 a.m., did something procedurally important. It meant the emergency session couldn't proceed without formally acknowledging the irregularity, because ignoring a written legal recommendation in the meeting record created a separate liability exposure that none of the board members who weren't Pratt wanted to absorb. Nora found this out from Sowers at 7:45 in the corridor outside the conference room while Greystone Valley woke up around them. "He's going to know you moved first," Sowers said. "I know. He's going to be angry." "I expect so." Sowers looked at her with the expression she'd been developing over 4 days of watching Nora operate. Something between professional respect and the slightly baffled quality of a person watching someone do a familiar job in an unfamiliar way and realizing the unfamiliar way works better. "You're not worried about him being angry?" "Angry people make mistakes," Nora said. "Calm ones set traps. Pratt's been calm for 6 years. I'd rather he be angry." She went to the annex before the session. She needed 10 minutes with Ghost more than she needed 10 minutes of additional preparation. He was at the enclosure door when she came in, standing, tail low but moving, watching the entrance with an attention that had changed quality over 4 days. Less braced, more open. She opened the door and he came out and walked beside her to the chair and sat when she sat, which was not a trained response. Nobody had taught him to sit beside a chair. He'd decided it was where he wanted to be, which was different and better. She put her hand on his head. She thought about Daniel's letter, about the last paragraph, which she hadn't told Simone about, and wasn't going to, because it was private in the specific way that things written between people who understood each other are private. He'd written about the program, about the framework, about the way institutions fail animals and people with the same mechanism, not cruelty, usually, but the slow calcification of assumption. The decision, made once and never revisited, about what something is and therefore what it's worth. He'd written, "You left because the system wasn't ready for what you built. I think it's ready now. I think you're the reason it's ready. I just didn't know how to tell you that while I was still here to say it." She sat with that for 10 minutes. Then she went upstairs. The emergency session had 9 people in it. Marsh, at the head, looking like a man who had not wanted this meeting and was going to manage it carefully because the alternative was worse. Sowers. Gallagher. 3 other board members from the previous day. Webb against the wall. Holt, whose presence Nora noted with quiet approval. Holt had asked to be included, and Marsh had allowed it. And Pratt. Pratt was 61, with the compact, organized energy of someone who had spent decades in institutional settings and learned their mechanics the way other people learn languages, fluently, without accent, with the ability to deploy the right phrase at the exact moment it would cost the listener the most to dispute. He had a folder. He'd come prepared. Nora sat across from him. Pratt opened by presenting the procedural argument. His version was technically precise. He'd done his homework, which she'd expected, and it focused on the expedited authorization as a deviation from standard protocol, with a recommendation that the clearance be suspended pending a formal 30-day review and that Ghost's case be transferred to a DoD-managed facility in the interim. Transfer, not termination. He'd adjusted his position overnight. It was a better position than termination, from a public relations standpoint, but it had the same functional endpoint. Ghost removed from Nora's care before the treatment was complete, which meant the behavioral collapse of an animal that had just begun to stabilize, which in a dog of Ghost's profile and history meant a second collapse was likely fatal. Pratt knew that. He'd done the research. Nora let him finish. Then Webb presented the 11 precedent cases. He'd had them printed, bound, tabbed, with the legal provision highlighted and a 1-page summary of the authorization framework written in language a civilian board could follow. He walked through it in 7 minutes. Clear, factual, no theater. The expedited provision was legal, documented, and had been used successfully 11 times. The 30-day review period existed for standard declassifications. The humanitarian provision was specifically designed for cases where that timeline would cause irreversible harm. The provision exists, Webb said, because the standard timeline has killed animals and ended careers. That's why it was written. Pratt said, "The provision has never been applied in a civilian hospital context." "That's correct," Webb said. "This is the first case of its kind. That doesn't make the provision inapplicable. It makes this case the precedent." Pratt looked at Nora. His expression was controlled, too controlled, the specific flatness of a man who had prepared for a different sequence of events and was now running a real-time recalculation. "The documentation irregularity," Gallagher said. She'd been waiting, and her timing was exact. "I'd like that addressed before we go further." Pratt said, "That's a separate matter." "It's a matter in this board's record as of 7:14 this morning," Sowers said, "which makes it this session's matter." Pratt looked at Sowers. Something moved in his expression, not anger yet, but its anterior stage, the recognition that the room's geometry was different from what he'd walked in expecting. "The discrepancy," Marsh said, "is a date difference of 2 days in the handler loss notification record. The board's legal team has flagged it as material to the negligence question." "Clerical error," Pratt said. "These things happen in complex intake situations. In a complex intake situation involving a decorated service animal with a documented behavioral flag," Gallagher said, "a 2-day discrepancy in when the handler death was acknowledged means someone in this facility knew he was grieving and chose not to document it accurately." The room absorbed that. "Which means," Gallagher continued, "the 6 days of deterioration, the injuries to staff, the termination order, all of it happened in a context where someone here had information that could have prevented it and didn't use it." Pratt said, "That's a significant inference from a clerical." "Who entered the original intake record?" Nora said. The question was simple and direct and landed in the room like a dropped instrument. Pratt looked at her. "It's a straightforward question," she said. "The intake record has an entry field. Someone's credentials are logged against it. Who entered it?" Sowers opened her laptop. She'd pulled the system log that morning. The original intake entry was made under Dr. Farrow's credentials at 14:32 on the day Ghost arrived. The notification date field was entered manually, not auto-populated from the DoD routing document. Manual entry. Pharaoh's credentials. A 2-day discrepancy. Pharaoh entered a date that was 2 days later than the actual notification, Nora said, which means the facility record showed Ghost as a standard distressed animal intake instead of a grief state emergency requiring immediate specialized protocol. Nobody said anything for a moment. If the correct date had been entered, Nora continued, the behavioral flag in his file would have triggered the specialized protocol requirement. Someone with my training or equivalent would have been contacted on day 1. He would not have spent 6 days deteriorating, he would not have injured 4 people, and the termination order would never have been generated. She looked at Pratt. You've been on this board for 6 years, she said. You've had oversight of the DoD pilot program from the beginning. You knew the protocol requirement, and you recommended Pharaoh for the senior physician role overseeing the annex. The room had gone very still. Pratt said, I'm not going to sit here and... I'm not accusing you of entering the record, Nora said. I'm noting that you recommended the person who did. And I'm noting that when the consequences of that record became a liability problem, the solution your consulting firm recommended was filing a complaint against the contractor who was fixing it. Pratt's control broke. Not dramatically. He wasn't a dramatic man. It broke in the small, specific way of a man who has built something over years and is watching it be named accurately in public for the first time, and the naming is worse than the thing itself because the thing could stay hidden, but the name can't be taken back. This is speculation, he said. His voice had a different quality now, tighter. You're a temporary contractor with a complicated credential history and a personal connection to this case, and you're making inferences that... The consulting firm, Sowers said. Henderson Pratt Liability Solutions, the Pratt in the firm name. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Gallagher looked at Pratt with the expression of a woman who had been on a board with him for 6 years and was revising 11 years of assessment in real time. It was not a comfortable thing to watch, but it was an honest one. Marsh said, We'll need to recess. We need an independent audit, Gallagher said, of all intake records in the Annex program, going back to inception, and we need Pratt recused from any further involvement in this case. Pratt said, You can't. The firm that bears your name advised the physician whose conduct is currently under formal review, Gallagher said. That's a conflict of interest that should have been disclosed 6 days ago. It wasn't. The recusal is the minimum. Pratt looked around the room. He was looking for an ally and not finding one, which was the particular loneliness of a man who has spent years building relationships that were functional rather than genuine and is discovering in the worst moment what that distinction costs. He closed his folder. He stood. He left without saying anything else, which was the most dignity available to him at that point, and he took it, and Nora watched him go with no particular satisfaction because it didn't feel like victory exactly. It felt like a correction. A thing that had been wrong for a long time being moved toward right, which was important and necessary, and not the same as clean. The recess lasted 40 minutes. When the session reconvened, Pratt was not in his chair. His formal recusal had been submitted in writing, which meant either he'd had it prepared in advance as a contingency, or someone had drafted it very quickly in 40 minutes. Nora suspected the former. He was a man who planned for losing. The remaining board moved through the audit commission, the independent record review, and the formal referral of the intake date discrepancy to the facility's ethics board in the time it takes to do things that people have already decided to do. Marsh conducted it with the efficiency of someone clearing a debt they'd rather not have incurred but understood was theirs. At the end, he looked at Nora. The contractor agreement, he said. The board is prepared to extend it through the completion of Ghost's rehabilitation, full facility access, full treatment authority, whatever you need. Thank you, she said. And he paused, which was unusual for him. The pause of a man choosing words carefully because the inadequate ones were the ones that came naturally. The initial handling of this situation was not acceptable. I understand that a formal acknowledgement doesn't undo the time that was lost or the conditions you were placed in. No, Nora said, it doesn't. I'm making it anyway. She looked at him. He was not a bad man. He He was a man who had managed institutional pressure badly and let someone else's certainty substitute for his own judgment, and had not moved fast enough when the weight of evidence should have moved him. That was a common failure. It was not a forgivable one by the people who had been harmed by it, but it was a recognizable one, and she'd decided somewhere in the middle of the night that recognizable didn't require her energy anymore. "I heard you," she said. "Let's move forward." She went to the annex. Ghost was waiting, not at the door. He was in the center of the room, sitting upright, watching the entrance with the open-faced attention of an animal that has decided the next person through the door is probably not a threat. Which was different from certainty. He'd learned the hard way that probably and certainly were different categories, and he wasn't going to collapse them again. But probably was enough to sit in the center of the room rather than the corner. Probably was enormous, coming from where he'd been. She opened the enclosure. She'd started leaving it open during her visits, letting him move in and out on his own terms, and sat in her chair, and he came to her and put his head in her lap and exhaled. She sat with both hands on him and didn't say anything for a long time. The afternoon light came through the high annex window at a low angle. Somewhere in the building, the ordinary machinery of a hospital proceeded. The PA calls, the cartwheels, the voices redirecting other voices. Outside, Delford was having a Thursday. Ordinary, indifferent, continuous. The world didn't restructure itself around what happened inside this room. It kept moving at its own pace. That was, Nora thought, both the hardest thing and the most important thing. The world's indifference, the way that grief and injustice and their eventual corrections all happened against a backdrop that didn't pause or annotate them. You did the work, and the world kept moving, and eventually the work was done, and the world was still moving, and you had to find your own way back into the current. Ghost pressed his nose against her knee. "I know," she said. "Me too." 3 days later, Simone Voss arrived in Delford. She drove herself. 6 hours from Columbus, which Nora found out afterward because she hadn't asked and Simone hadn't mentioned it until she was already in the parking lot. She called from the car. "I'm outside. I wasn't sure if I should have called first." "Come in," Nora said. "He's ready." Simone was 28, dark-haired with Daniel's same quality of directness in the eyes. The family resemblance wasn't physical so much as attentional. The way they both looked at things straight on without the small deflective movements most people use to manage difficult moments. She walked into the annex and stopped 3 feet inside the door and looked at Ghost. Ghost looked at her. He took 2 steps forward. His nose worked. He took another step. Then he made the low chest sound, the one Nora had learned to read as recognition. And Simone's composure, which had been holding through the drive and the parking lot and the corridor, came apart in a single exhalation. She went to her knees on the annex floor, and Ghost pressed his forehead against hers, and they stayed like that, the woman and the dog, both of them carrying the same loss in different bodies, finding each other in the middle of it. Nora stood by the door. She was not someone who cried easily or publicly. The tears that had found her in the last week had been private, in the way of someone who has learned to be a fixed point for others, and understands, without resentment, that this means your own falling apart happens in small installments rather than all at once. She let this one go, just briefly, just enough. Then she straightened and let Simone have the room. Farrow's formal review concluded 19 days after the emergency session. The findings were not gentle. Credential obstruction, documented. Treatment access limitation, documented. Manual intake data entry inconsistent with source documents, not ruled deliberate, but noted as a significant procedural failure with material consequences. The consulting relationship through Pratt's firm was classified as an undisclosed conflict of interest. He lost the senior physician designation overseeing the annex program. He retained his general clinical privileges at Greystone Valley under a probationary framework that required independent oversight of all administrative decisions for 24 months. It was not the ending that some people thought he deserved, and not the clean restoration others would have preferred. It was complicated and imprecise, the way institutional accountability usually is, not satisfying in the way that simple verdicts are satisfying, but accurate in the way that life is accurate, which is messier and more durable. Nora wasn't in the building when the findings were released. She heard about them from Sowers by phone while she was in the annex running Ghost through a structured exercise sequence that had, over the previous 2 weeks, evolved from basic movement patterns into something that looked, to anyone observing, like a working dog regaining functional capability in real time. He wasn't there yet. She wasn't going to overstate it. But he was moving in that direction with a consistency and a willingness that she documented carefully every day, because the documentation was going to matter. For the program, for the case literature, for the 14 other animals being handled with her framework, and for whatever came next. Pratt? She asked Sowers, resigned from the board 3 days after the recess, before the audit results came in. A pause. He moved faster than the process, probably had legal advice. Is there a separate investigation? The ethics board is reviewing whether the conflict of interest rises to reportable conduct. That process takes months. But it started. It started, Sowers confirmed. She put the phone away and looked at Ghost, who had stopped mid-exercise and was watching her with the patient, slightly impatient expression of an animal, waiting for the human to stop being distracted by the human world and come back to the task. Sorry, she said. He made a short sound. I know. Focus. She ran him through the rest of the sequence. He completed it clean. She called Webb that evening and told him yes. Not the full reinstatement, not the return to active program operations in the original capacity, because that capacity had required things she'd given up and didn't intend to give back. But the protocol review, the formal adoption of the framework, the role that Webb had described in the documentation as senior consulting architect, which was a title she'd made him change twice before she accepted it, because the original versions had been too grandiose. And she'd told him she didn't need a title that compensated for something when the work itself was compensation enough. It's not going to be simple, Webb said. I know. There will be resistance. The program has people who built their careers on the previous approach. People resist things that make their old methods look inadequate. That's not the same as being wrong about the new ones. She paused. I've handled that before. You left because of it. I left because I thought I had to choose between the work and the fight about the work. I don't think that's true anymore. What changed? She thought about Ghost eating for the first time in 6 days, about Simone on the annex floor, about Daniel's letter and what he'd written about readiness, not the program's readiness, hers, about the specific difference between a system that needs someone to move it and a person who decides they're going to be the one who does. I got a clearer picture, she said. On the last morning before she formally transitioned Ghost's care to the ongoing rehabilitation framework, Holt would continue the work with Nora's remote consultation, which was the right structure, and they'd both arrived at it without much argument. Nora came to the annex at 6 a.m. Ghost was already awake. He was sitting at the front of his enclosure, door open, by standing arrangement, looking at the high window where the early light came through. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment before he heard her. He turned. He stood. He walked to her without hesitation. She knelt down to his level, which she didn't often do because it disrupted the working relationship geometry, but this wasn't a working moment. This was something else. He pressed his forehead against hers. She held that. She thought about what it had cost to get here. Not her, but him. 6 days in a corner. 6 days of loss so complete it had shut down the basic will to eat. An animal who had been trained to trust one human above all others and had lost that human in a place too far away to make sense of, and had been brought to a facility that didn't understand what it was looking at and nearly destroyed him for it. And then, a chair. A slow approach. 3 inches at a time. A familiar smell. A photograph. A rope toy. Presence without pressure. And time. And the simple insistence on staying when everyone expected her to leave. The work wasn't magic. It was never magic. It was attention and patience and the refusal to decide what something was before you understood what it needed. Which was, Nora had come to believe, the same thing in every context. With animals, with people, with systems that had calcified around wrong assumptions and needed someone to move them. You stayed. You watched. You used what you knew and you learned what you didn't. You didn't demand the response you expected. You created the conditions for the response that was possible. And sometimes if you stayed long enough and the conditions were right, something that had shut down entirely found its way back. Okay, she said to Ghost. Quietly. Just the one word. He stepped back. He looked at her. He looked at the door behind her, and the corridor beyond it, and the light that was starting to come through in earnest now, the way Pennsylvania mornings do. Slow, and then suddenly all at once. Ready? She asked. Ghost walked to the corridor door, stopped, and looked back at her. That was her answer. She walked him through the east corridor for the last time as the primary handler. Staff stopped what they were doing. Not theatrically. It wasn't like that. Nobody had staged it. But word had moved through the building over 3 weeks the way real things move, slowly and by accumulation, and people had arrived at a different understanding of what they'd witnessed in the first 48 hours. Terrence, in the corridor by radiology, stopped his cart and stood straight. Reuben, coming off his overnight, nodded once, the specific nod of a man who uses the gesture for things that don't need more than that. Alicia, passing with a medication tray, paused and then kept moving because she had patience. And that was the right decision, and she'd make it every time. Devin was near the east exit. He'd been quieter over the preceding weeks, not subdued, just recalibrated. He looked at Ghost and then at Nora, and he said, "He looks good." "He is good," she said. "You going to be back?" Consulting basis. She stopped walking. "You'd make a decent handler candidate, you know, if you wanted." Devin looked at her. He clearly hadn't expected that. "For the program?" "There's a training track. Webb's team runs it. It's not easy." He looked at Ghost, who was watching him with that steady, assessing attention. "And he passed judgment on me?" "A while ago," Nora said. "He just didn't tell you." Devin looked at the dog for another moment. Something rearranged in his face, the specific look of a person being offered a direction they hadn't known was available. "I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking." Sent. She left Greystone Valley at 10:30 a.m. with the duffel bag, the notebook, and Daniel's letter. She sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, the way she had on the first night, though everything else was different. The same wet asphalt. Different light, different weight. She thought about what it meant to be dismissed, not misjudged. Farrow had been right about that distinction, though she hadn't explained the full dimension of it at the time. Misjudgment was an information problem. Dismissal was a decision you made before the information arrived, a conclusion you drew from the shape of a person rather than the content of them. It was lazy in the specific way that expertise becomes lazy when it stops questioning its own assumptions. And it was dangerous in the specific way that lazy expertise is always dangerous. Not malicious, usually, just blind. Moving through the world as if the category already told you what the individual contained. She'd been dismissed because she was a woman, because she was a nurse, because she was young enough to be someone's resident and quiet enough to be someone's assistant, and wearing scrubs that didn't advertise what she'd done or where she'd been or what she was capable of. Every one of those things had been a disqualification in the minds of people who were deciding what she was worth before she opened her mouth. And Ghost had known, from the moment she walked through the door, that their calculation was wrong. There was something in that. Not triumphant, not bitter, just clarifying. The dog had seen what the doctors missed, which was not because dogs were smarter than doctors or instinct better than training. It was because Ghost had no investment in a predetermined category. He was reading what was actually in front of him, not what he expected to find. She wanted to carry that. She wanted to take it into every room she walked into going forward. Not the anger about being dismissed, which was real and valid and belonged to her, but the thing underneath it. The discipline of seeing what was actually there. Of not letting the shape of a situation substitute for the substance of it. She started the engine. Her phone buzzed. Simone Voss. "He ate his whole breakfast again this morning. Holt sent me a video." "Thank you. I don't have a better word for it. Just thank you." Nora looked at the message for a moment. She typed back, "That's enough. That's the whole thing." She pulled out of the parking lot. 3 months later, the first public presentation of the Combat Trauma Rehabilitation Framework was made at a joint medical conference in Washington, D.C. The presentation was co-authored by Nora Vance and Dr. Sylvia Holt. which was not a pairing either of them had anticipated and turned out to be the strongest version of the work because they disagreed about enough that the final document was tighter than either would have produced alone. Nora presented the clinical findings section. She'd never been comfortable with the conference format, the podium, the dim room, the expectation of performance, and she didn't pretend otherwise. She was direct and specific and didn't embellish. The data was sufficient. The 14 recovery cases in the program, Ghost's case as the primary clinical narrative, the methodology laid out in terms that practitioners could apply without a classified background. After the presentation, a woman in the third row raised her hand. She was in military medical dress, mid-40s, with the look of someone who had been in the field long enough for the field to show. "The case at Greystone Valley," she said. "The dog. Is he... What happened to him?" Nora looked at her. "He's in active rehabilitation," she said. "Full behavioral recovery. He's being considered for a training role in the program. Younger handlers. His working life isn't over." The woman nodded. She had the look of someone who had asked the question expecting a worse answer. "And the framework," she said. "If I have a case, a handler loss, acute grief state, who do I call?" Nora said, "There's a contact in the program documentation. We're operational." It wasn't a dramatic moment. There was no applause, no marked shift in the room's energy. The woman wrote something down and the session moved forward, and Holt presented the next section, and the conference continued in the way that conferences continue. Imperfectly, usefully, the information moving slowly from the people who had it to the people who needed it, which was the only mechanism by which anything in medicine actually changed. But the woman wrote it down, and that was how it started. Not with a declaration or a vindication or a moment designed for anyone to witness, but with a question asked directly and an answer given the same way, and information passing between two people who understood the cost of not having it. Ghost's formal reinstatement into the program came 4 months after Greystone Valley. Not combat deployment. That chapter was closed, and Nora had made sure the documentation was clear on that because there were people who would have pushed him back into operational use, and she wasn't going to allow it. What was reinstated was his service record and his status. Honored, active in a support capacity, recognized for 11 deployments and 1 Medal of Valor, and a recovery that the program now used as its primary case reference. He worked with new handlers in training, younger dogs learning the job. Ghost was steady with them in a way that wasn't teachable as a technique, the specific steadiness of an animal that had been to the edge of something and come back and therefore wasn't frightened by the things that frightened the inexperienced. He showed them what calm looked like. He showed them that it was possible. Simone came to visit twice. She brought photographs, Daniel's photographs, printed copies of the ones from the forward operating area. Ghost recognized them, not with distress, with the recognition of an animal that had found a way to carry what it carried. He pressed his nose against the laminated edges and made the low chest sound and then moved on, because he was always moving now, always oriented toward the door and whatever was beyond it. On the second visit, Simone stood beside Nora in the program facility's main yard and watched Ghost work with a new dog, a young German shepherd who had just arrived and didn't know yet where anything was. And she said, "He's teaching." "Yes," Nora said. "Daniel would have..." Simone stopped, started differently. "He always said Ghost was smarter than most people he knew." "He wasn't wrong." Simone smiled. It had grief in it, but it had other things now too. "Thank you for picking up that call." From Simone Voss, middle of the night, "You didn't know me." I knew who you were," Nora said. "He wrote about you." "He wrote about you too." Simone paused. "He said you were the kind of person who made things make sense, that when it was bad over there, it helped to know there were people like you who understood what it cost." Nora stood with that. She didn't have a clean response to it. She wasn't a person who accepted certain kinds of acknowledgement gracefully because she'd spent most of her career in positions where acknowledgement wasn't the point and had to be actively avoided. But this was Daniel's sister, and it was Daniel's words, and some things deserved to be received rather than redirected. "He was good at seeing people clearly," she said finally. "It was his best quality." Simone nodded. "Yes, it was." In the yard, Ghost had moved alongside the young shepherd, not leading but parallel, showing by proximity rather than direction the specific teaching method of an animal that had learned what it meant to be given space instead of commands. The young dog looked sideways at him. Ghost looked forward. The yard was quiet except for the ordinary sounds of the facility. Wind, distant traffic, the mechanical hum of something working correctly. The ordinary texture of a day that was not remarkable from the outside and was, from the inside, exactly what it needed to be. Nora watched Ghost move in the pale morning light, and she thought, this is what it looks like when something that was broken finds a new shape. Not the original, not what it was before. Something different that contains the before and carries it forward. She thought about the annex at Greystone Valley, the folding chair, the 3 inches at a time. The long nights when nothing visible was changing and she was operating on the knowledge that visible and real were not the same thing. The systematic insistence on being present when everyone expected her to leave. She thought about what it cost to be dismissed and to stay anyway. To know what you know and hold it quietly and let the work speak, because the work is always, eventually, louder than the people trying to drown it out. She thought about all the people in hospitals, in boardrooms, in corridors and break rooms, who had looked at her and seen the wrong thing, and how none of them had been able to make the wrong thing true. How the category never became the fact. How every assumption made about her in the first 48 hours had collapsed under the weight of what she actually was. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, but with the specific inevitability of truth in a situation where someone was paying close enough attention. You couldn't dismiss something into not existing. You could delay its recognition. You could make the path harder and the timeline longer and the cost higher. But if the thing was real, if the capability was genuine and the work was done and the intention was clear, it persisted. It waited. It stayed in the room. And eventually the room had to acknowledge what was in it. Ghost stopped at the far end of the yard and looked back at her. She raised one hand. He turned and walked forward, steady, deliberate, alive in a way that 6 weeks ago had been far from certain. And the young shepherd followed him, because that was what happened when someone showed you how. "Ready?" Nora said softly, though she was the only one close enough to hear it. Ghost stepped forward without hesitation, as he always had, as he always would.